We've spent the last 4 lessons setting a foundation for faith and belief in what we call the gospel. The gospel is the good news of what Jesus Christ did to fix humanity's sin problem. But before we can truly understand the gospel, we need to understand what the sin problem really is. We started with, is there a God? We talked about DNA, among other things, as a scientific reasoning of intelligence and the existence of God. Then we moved on to, can we trust the Bible? We used archaeological evidence, common sense, historical evidence, and personal experience to show the Bible truly is unique among all books ever. We talked about how we can trust that God will not lie to us, and how we can trust that God gave each human author of the Bible the words to write in the book or books of the Bible that they wrote. And then we showed the impossibility of 40 different authors never contradicting one another. Then we moved on to the first of the 7 C's. We talked about creation and how God originally created the universe to be. We zoomed in on the creation of mankind and highlighted our unique qualities among all other creation and our status as image bearers of God and as the beings created to be in dominion over the perfect world He created. We also pointed out that the world we live in today is far from a perfect world. There is sin and suffering. Well, today we're going to discuss what exactly happened that changed God's very good or excellent, happy, or valuable to what we have today. Today we're going to talk about corruption, the corruption of God's very good creation. Let's remember again exactly what God said when He was done with His creation work. Genesis 1:31 says, "And God saw all that He had made, and behold, it was very good." At this point, God had created mankind, Adam and Eve, and they were perfect like all of God's creation. Adam had embraced his job of naming the animals and tending to God's creation. As we saw last time, and Eve had embraced her role as Adam's helper in all of it. God told Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply, and life was perfect. There was nothing in existence that looked like what we see in our world now. No war, no death, no violence, none of it. As a reminder, let's look at God's first command to mankind. In Genesis chapter 2, verses 15 through 17, God says, "Then the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate it and tend it. The Lord God commanded the man, saying, 'From any tree of the garden you may freely eat, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for on the day that you eat from it, you will certainly die.'" Note the command in red. Let's reread that part. "From any tree of the garden you may freely eat, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for on the day that you eat from it you will certainly die." What were the parameters of the command? What could they eat? And what could they not eat? And why? So God told Adam and Eve that there was only one tree they could not eat from. They were free to eat of any tree in the garden except for just this one in the entire garden. Does that command seem difficult to you? Let's see what happened. Genesis chapter 3 begins with an interesting conversation. In Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 through 5, the fall of mankind. "Now the serpent was more cunning than any animal of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, 'Has God really said, you shall not eat from any tree of the garden?' The woman said to the serpent, 'From the fruit of the trees of the garden we may eat. But from the fruit of the tree which is in the middle of the garden, God has said, you shall not eat from it or touch it, or you will die.' The serpent said to the woman, 'You certainly will not die. For God knows that on the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will become like God, knowing good and evil. Let's look closely at what the serpent said first, in blue. Has God really said, "You shall not eat from any tree of the garden"? Is that what God had actually said? Let's read his words again from Genesis 2:16 and 17. God said, "From any tree of the garden you may freely eat, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for on the day that you eat from it you will certainly die." So, is what Satan quoted what God actually said? Compare with what Satan said. Do they match? No. So here we have Satan, in effect, possessing the serpent and speaking directly to Eve. And just to refresh our minds, who did God make as the head of the little family of Adam and Eve? Who was created first? Adam was. And who was created to be the helper? Eve was. Who is Satan talking to? He's talking to Eve. Why do you think Satan is not talking to Adam? Satan pounced where he saw a weak link. And I don't mean that to say that women are weak, but Adam was the one that God placed in the role of head of their little family of two. Adam's job was to care for God's creation, of which Eve was a part. Her job was to help Adam. Satan singled out Eve, and notice, Adam is not mentioned yet. Satan singled out Eve because he assumed he could easily confuse and persuade her because she was not the head of the family, nor was her protector nearby. She wasn't thinking like the head that bore the responsibility to care for the garden because she was created for a different purpose. She was the helper. She was thinking like a helper, and she was chatting with the serpent, and it may not have been all that strange of an occurrence at that point in time. So how did Eve answer the serpent? Her words are in red. Let's reread them. From the fruit of the trees of the garden we may eat, but from the fruit of the tree which is in the middle of the garden, God has said, "You shall not eat from it or touch it, or you will die." Did Eve quote God correctly? She did not. Notice the difference. Eve adds a phrase. She put more restriction on what she and Adam were allowed by God to eat and do than God did. As humans, we often do this. We say God said, "Do not do some activity," and we determine, well, I will not do that activity and I will also not do this other activity, as if that makes us more acceptable to God to go a measure beyond what he has commanded. But God made us and he knows us. He knows it is simply our pride when we think we know better than he does what is good for us. Eve's pride was peeking its head up and waving its arms for attention when she added or touch it to God's words here. Up to this point, all Satan had done was to ask an intelligent yet simple question and wait for a response. However, his question was targeted right at Eve's pride, which until this point had never led her to sin. Satan misquoted God intentionally so that Eve would jump in quickly to God's defense. As if Eve could ever offer any sort of defense for God, as if God even needs one, as if God needs to defend himself from Satan's accusations. Next, we see the serpent or Satan's response to Eve's answer. Now we see the lies Satan tells. Let's read the pink words. For you will certainly not die. For God knows that on the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened and you will become like God, knowing good and evil. God said they would die on the very day they ate from that tree. He didn't clarify for them that not only would they introduce physical death into the perfect creation, but spiritual death would happen in that instant. Relationship with a holy and perfect Creator God would be broken. God didn't clarify this for them because to obey His command, they didn't need the detail. They just needed to obey. But the serpent, or Satan, has twisted God's words. He's lied, and he said something that also appealed to Eve's pride. He told her she would become like God. Well, last week we learned that she was already like God. She was His image bearer. So what did Satan mean? He meant that she could now be the boss. She would know what God knows, and she would be in control of her life. Isn't that how we all think deep in our hearts? We want to be in total control and be the ones in charge of our lives. Well, all that kind of thinking started right here in the garden with this conversation.